The Whisper in the Attic. The McNeils had only just moved into the Georgetown townhouse when the whispers began. It was a charming, old brick house on Prospect Street, built in the early 1900s, narrow, 3 stories tall, with ivy creeping up the side and creaky wood floors that gave it character. Chris McNeil, a well-known actress taking a break from Hollywood, had rented the place while filming in Washington, D.C. She hoped the quiet neighborhood would be good for her 12-year-old daughter, Regan. The first few days passed uneventfully. Chris decorated the house with candles, books, and old rugs from their travels. Regan, a shy but curious child, quickly settled into the upstairs bedroom with its slanted ceiling and a window view of the neighbor's garden. But something about the attic felt off. At first, Chris thought she was imagining things, just the natural groans of an old house adjusting to the weather, but the noises became too specific to ignore. Every night around 2:30 a.m., faint footsteps echoed overhead in the attic, soft at first, then unmistakably human. Thump, creak, shuffle. "Probably rats," said Carl, the Swiss caretaker, when Chris mentioned it. He set traps, checked for signs of pests, but found nothing. No droppings, no holes, no movement in the insulation. Still, the sounds continued. One night, Chris awoke to the sound of heavy breathing, not from Regan, who was fast asleep beside her during a thunderstorm, but from above the attic. Slow, raspy, and deliberate, like someone standing just beyond the ceiling, struggling to breathe. She froze. It stopped the moment she sat up. Chris climbed the attic stairs the next morning, flashlight in hand, brushing away cobwebs and lifting the creaky wooden hatch. Dust danced in the narrow beam of light. The attic was empty, just old trunks, forgotten furniture, and shadows. But she noticed something odd. A small wooden chair had been moved. It now sat in the center of the attic, facing the corner. She hadn't put it there. Regan began complaining about cold drafts in her room, even with the windows shut and heat on. The air around her bed felt icy. "It's like something's breathing," she told her mother. "Only it's not you." Chris tried to comfort her. "Old houses do strange things, sweetheart, don't worry." But Regan's unease grew. She began sleepwalking, something she'd never done before. Chris would find her standing at the bottom of the attic stairs, eyes open but vacant, murmuring something under her breath. One night, Chris followed her silently. Regan padded barefoot across the hallway, stepped onto the attic stairs, and stood at the hatch door. Her small hand reached up and gently tapped the wood. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Then she whispered, "Are you still there?" Chris's breath caught in her throat. She rushed forward, grabbing Regan by the shoulders. The girl blinked, confused. "Mom, what are we doing here?" Chris decided to lock the attic door. But the next morning, it was open again. A few days later, Regan brought home an old Ouija board from a yard sale down the block. She showed it to her mother, giggling. "It's just for fun." Chris didn't like it, but didn't want to make a fuss. "All right, just be careful. Don't play with it too much." That night, Chris overheard her daughter whispering in her room. At first, she thought Regan was on the phone with a friend. But when she peeked in, the lights were off, and Regan sat cross-legged on the floor, the Ouija board in front of her. Her fingers were on the planchette, gliding smoothly to smooth lie across the board. She was alone. Chris stepped closer. "Sweetie, who are you talking to?" Regan didn't look up. "I'm talking to Captain Howdy," she said. Chris chuckled nervously. "Captain who?" "That's his name. He lives upstairs." Chris paused. "You mean, in the attic?" Regan nodded. "He says it's his house now." Strange things began happening with more frequency. The lights would flicker, even after the electrician checked the wiring. Doors slammed by themselves. Cold gusts of wind burst from nowhere. The smell of sulfur like burnt matching in Regan's room, no matter how often it was cleaned. One morning, Chris walked in to find Regan sitting motionless at her desk. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. The room was freezing. Every candle had gone out. Chris touched her daughter's shoulder. "Honey?" Regan turned slowly. Her lips were cracked, dry, her voice hoarse. "He won't let me sleep anymore." Chris began to break. She confided in Father Damien Carras, a young Jesuit priest who taught at Georgetown University. She had met him briefly at a fundraiser and remembered he specialized in psychology. "I think my daughter is sick," she told him, "but not in the way doctors understand." Carras was skeptical but agreed to visit. He met Regan one afternoon. She was quieter now, withdrawn. She stared at him for several minutes before smiling. "I know your mother's sick," she said softly. Carras stiffened. His mother had been hospitalized just days earlier. He hadn't told anyone. "She's dying, isn't she?" Regan added, voice deeper than before. Carras left disturbed, but unsure. "It might be psychological stress." Chris nodded but didn't believe it. The house had changed. It breathed. It watched. That night, the attic exploded with sound. Chris and Carl ran up, expecting to find an animal or a burglar. But the attic was empty except for the wooden chair, now lying on its side. Carved into the attic wall were 3 letters. Right, G. Backwards, as if scratched from inside the wall. Chris checked Regan's hands. Her fingernails were raw. Over the following days, Regan's condition deteriorated rapidly. She lashed out at doctors. Her bed shook violently in the night. Furniture moved on its own. She spoke in voice deep, growling tones that did not belong to a 12-year-old girl. One morning, Chris found her daughter hovering several inches above her mattress, eyes rolled back, limbs rigid. She screamed. The doctors gave up. "We've run every test, neurological, psychological. There's no medical explanation." Chris turned to Father Carras again. "I want an exorcism," she said. He looked at her, stunned. "We don't just do those anymore." "Then help me prove it's real." Carras agreed to begin observations. He documented the events. Scratches appearing on Regan's body without cause. Her ability to speak Latin fluently, never studying it. Her unnatural strength. Her knowledge of secret sins. One night, while recording her voice during sleep, he played the tape backwards. What he heard chilled him to his core. Multiple voices, overlapping, whispering. Some wept, some laughed. One hissed, "She is mine." The whisper in the attic had become a roar in their lives, and it was only the beginning. Her voice is not hers. Chris MacNeil no longer recognized her daughter. The change had started with whispers, cold rooms, and strange dreams, but now it was in her voice. Regan didn't sound like Regan anymore. Her once bright tone had been replaced by a guttural rasp that vibrated with something ancient. And it didn't just sound like one voice. Sometimes it echoed. Sometimes it layered over itself. Sometimes it wasn't even human. One rainy evening, Chris sat on the edge of Regan's bed, gently brushing her hair. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered. Regan didn't respond. Chris smiled weakly and leaned forward to kiss her forehead. But before her lips could touch skin, Regan's eyes snapped open, bloodshot, glassy. A deep male voice emerged from her throat. "She can't hear you anymore." Chris recoiled, heart pounding. "Regan?" The girl blinked, her face contorted into a grin that wasn't hers. Her lips cracked and bled as the corners of her mouth stretched wider than seemed possible. "Little pig, little liar, little thief," the voice sneered, mocking Chris. Chris backed away, trembling. "Stop it, this isn't funny." Regan's body began to tremble, but the voice kept going, grasping details only Chris could have known. The name of a childhood dog that had drowned. The secret abortion she'd had at 19. Things no one could possibly know. Chris ran from the room, slamming the door behind her. Father Damien Carras returned the next day, recorder in hand. "I need to gather proof," he told Chris. "If I'm going to request an exorcism from the church, they'll demand undeniable evidence, speech in languages unknown to her, knowledge of the unknowable, signs of supernatural strength or phenomena." Chris barely slept. "You'll get your proof. Just wait." That night, Kara sat beside Regan, who now lay restrained to her bed with soft bindings. She'd attacked a nurse the day before, biting through her gown. He tried a calm approach. "Hello, Regan. Do you know who I am?" Regan's eyes remained closed. Kara's continued. "Can you tell me who's inside you?" There was a pause, then a low, gravelly voice filled the room. "You're the doubter." Kara straightened. "What's your name?" Regan began convulsing, mild at first, then violently, her wrists tugging against the restraints. Her mouth opened, and a stream of guttural Latin poured out, fluid and unbroken. "Et verbum caro factum estate et habitavit in nobis." Kara stared, stunned. He leaned in. "Regan, have you ever studied Latin?" She didn't respond. Then another language emerged, Aramaic, then ancient Greek, then French, one after the other. With terrifying fluency, Kara's recognized fragments. Some were biblical verses, others were blasphemies, some he couldn't identify at all. The girl's body relaxed again, collapsing back onto the bed. Silence. Kara's hit stop on the tape recorder and left the room in a daze. Later, he played the recording for Chris and a linguistics expert from the university. They slowed it down, reversed sections, and transcribed patterns. "This isn't gibberish," the professor said. "She's speaking real language, some dead, some obscure. This isn't something a child learns accidentally." Chris leaned in. "Can you tell what it means?" The professor nodded grimly. "Mostly scripture, some invocations. But it's her voice. See, there's more than one." Kara's pressed play again. They listened. At the 46-second mark, a new voice emerged, higher-pitched, childlike, and terrified. "Help me, please. I'm still here. I don't want to die, Mommy." Chris burst into tears. It was Regan, buried under layers of other voices. The church wasn't convinced yet. They still wanted physical proof, something undeniable. That came 3 nights later. Regan began screaming glong, inhuman shrieks that shook the walls. Chris, Carl, and Kara's ran to her room. Her bed was lifting off the floor. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5. The air was thick and buzzing. A crucifix flew off the wall and shattered. Drawers opened and slammed. Candles around the room exploded in a gust of wind. Kara stepped forward, holding a vial of holy water. He sprinkled it onto Regan's chest. She shrieked in agony, her skin blistering instantly. But the next morning, Kara's admitted something disturbing. "That wasn't holy water," he confessed. "It was regular tap water. I wanted to see if it was psychological." Chris went pale. "Then how did she react like that?" "She believed it was real," Kara said. "Or something else did." Chris was reaching her breaking point. Regan's face was changing. Her skin grew pale and mottled, bruised with strange marks. Her eyes, once soft hazel, now gleamed yellow in low light. Her lips were cracked and dry, often covered in blood. Worse, the voice no longer waited to be provoked. It spoke on its own. Late at night, Chris would lie in bed, praying for silence. But the voice would echo through the halls, deep, mocking, obscene. She once heard it sing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the devil tells me so." The next morning, Regan didn't remember singing it, or so she claimed. Father Karras brought in another priest, an older man, Father Marin. He was no stranger to exorcisms. He had performed one years ago in Africa, and he carried that memory with him, like a scar. When Marin entered the house, he paused in the foyer and crossed himself. "She's up there," Chris whispered. "She's waiting." Marin nodded. "We'll begin at sunrise." Before dawn, the 2 priests stood at Regan's door, prayer books in hand, holy water and crucifixes ready. Inside, Regan laughed. "2 flies for 1 web." Her voice dropped into a chorus of sound cinemastic, ancient, echoing. Karas opened his book. Marin began. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Regan's body spasmed. Stop it, she's ours, she screamed. The power of Christ compels you, Marin shouted. Regan shrieked. The walls trembled. Her bed rattled. Her restraints tore loose. She levitated again, limbs stretched wide like a broken puppet. So many names: Legion, Azazel, Belial. Pick one, pick all. Kara stepped back, sweating. She's deteriorating her heart. Keep going, Marin commanded. The voice continued, alternating between threats and pleas. Sometimes it begged them to stop. Sometimes it laughed. Then it switched again. This time, it was Karas's mother's voice. Damien, you left me to die. Why, Damien? Why? He dropped his book. Marin placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Don't listen. That's not your mother. Regan smiled with bloody teeth. She's burning now. Want to see? Marin poured more holy water onto her. Smoke rose from her skin. The room filled with screams, dozens of them, male, female, childlike. After 3 hours, Regan collapsed. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed. She looked like herself again. Almost. Chris entered quietly, kneeling beside the bed. My baby. She touched her daughter's hand. It flinched. Her eyes opened. The voice returned. She's still mine. Chris screamed. Karas pulled her back. Father Marin continued to pray, undeterred. He didn't stop for hours. By nightfall, Marin was pale and trembling. Sweat soaked through his collar. He looked at Karas, his face lined with exhaustion. Take a break, rest, I'll stay with her. Karas hesitated, then stepped into the hall. Minutes passed. When he returned, Marin was slumped in the chair, unmoving. Karas rushed to his sedate, no pulse, no breath. Regan sat upright, watching him. He was weak. You're weaker. Want to join him? Karas stared, broken. Then he snapped. Take me, he whispered. Take me instead. The room went silent. Regan blinked, then screamed. Karas lunged at her. Come into me, leave her. Her body convulsed, then went still. Karas staggered back, his face twisted, eyes wide, lips trembling. The voice of thing was now inside him. He turned toward the window. For one brief moment, he stared into Regan's eyes, filled now with fear and clarity. Then he hurled himself through the window. Regan was free, but the house still whispered. 3 a.m. visitors. The wind howled around the old Georgetown house like a wounded animal. It was nearly 3 weeks after Father Karas had hurled himself from the window wafter. The demon was supposedly gone. The house had fallen silent. Regan, once a hollow shell of herself, was sleeping again, eating, laughing even. She didn't remember the worst parts, at least that's what she said. And maybe that was a mercy. Chris had taken her daughter far from D.C., renting a cabin in the Virginia countryside, away from the press, the priests, and the past. But not everything stayed behind. Father Thomas Keene arrived quietly. Young, fresh from seminary, he had been assigned to assist with the cleanup and restoration of the house on Prospect Street, as part of the church's quiet investigation into the exorcism and its fallout. The Vatican wanted it kept discreet. Officially, Father Karas had died of a fall. Unofficially, the case had been flagged for extended observation. Keene had heard the rumors. Every priest had. The whispers of what happened in that bedroom. The tapes, the levitation, the deaths. But he didn't believe all of it. He couldn't, not if he wanted to sleep at night. Still, the first time he stepped inside, his stomach turned. It wasn't anything visible. The house looked empty, clean, even walls repainted, curtains replaced, furniture gone. But the air was wrong. It was heavy, still, like something waiting. Father Keene chose to stay overnight, per the church's request, to monitor for residual energy, a term he found vague and unsettling. They wanted someone there, alone, to observe, to document. He lit a candle on the kitchen table and opened his prayer journal. The first night passed without incident. He read scripture. He prayed. He slept lightly on the living room couch, the crucifix tight in his hand. The silence was thick, but unbroken, until the clock struck 3 a.m. A soft knock. Keen sat upright, heart pounding. Tap-a-tap-a-tap. It came from the hallway closet, just off the stairs. He approached slowly, candle in hand. "Hello," he called. "Is someone here?" No response. He opened the closet. Empty. Just coats and a dusty umbrella. But as he turned away, he heard it again. This time from upstairs. Tap-a-tap-a-tap. He climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The attic door stood closed at the top. He froze. The knocking continued at 3 steady taps, always at 3 a.m. Not before. Not after. That night, he didn't open it. By the 4th night, Keen was unraveling. The candle flames flickered when there was no wind. Doors creaked open on their own. He began to hear whispers-not voices he could understand, just murmurs like a crowd pressing in. But always, at 3 a.m., the knocking returned. He opened the attic door on the 5th night. Dust swirled in the air like fog. The chair in the center had returned, though no one had placed it there. He stepped inside. "Who's there?" he whispered. The door slammed behind him. He turned, but no one was there. The attic was ice cold. The candle flickered and died, and in that complete darkness, he heard it, breathing. Not his own. Wet, heavy, right behind him. He spun, lifting the candle like a weapon. Nothing. But something exhaled directly into his ear. Keen didn't sleep that night. He paced the downstairs hall, clutching his Bible, muttering the Lord's Prayer. He called his superior the next morning. "There's still something here," he said. "It didn't leave with the girl." The reply was calm, clinical. "Remained for 3 more days. Continued documenting." He wanted to refuse, but something compelled him to stay. The 6th night, the crucifix fell off the wall. Twice. He nailed it back, hands shaking. The temperature in the house dropped so low his breath came in clouds, and the whispers returned. Louder now, closer. They called his name. "Thomas. Father, we missed you." He found a message scratched into the wall behind the crucifix. "Still here." He prayed harder that night. He sprinkled holy water in every room. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her, Regan, standing at the top of the stairs, eyes blank, blood dripping from her fingers. On the 7th night, Keen couldn't move. Not in the dream. Not in his body. Sleep paralysis, maybe, but it felt real. He lay on the couch, eyes open, unable to breathe, unable to scream. A shadow stood over him, tall, raw, its head twisted unnaturally to one side, as if broken at the neck. It whispered, "You invited us in." When he finally moved again, it was 3:03 a.m. The attic stairs creaked. The next morning, he found scratches on his chest, 3 lines, deep, like claws. He called again. "This is demonic. I don't care what anyone says. I'm not imagining this." The voice on the other end paused, then calmly said, "We're sending help." Another priest. That night, Father Nolan arrived, older, grizzled, and quiet. He didn't speak much, just nodded and unpacked holy tools, rosaries, incense, vials of blessed oil. Together, they blessed the house, room by room, floor by floor, and then they reached the attic. Nolan stopped before the door. "Have you opened it?" he asked. Keen nodded. "Alone?" "Yes." Nolan sighed. "Then it's seen you." The blessing lasted hours. The attic resisted. Wind howled through cracks that weren't there. The candle flames danced wildly. One exploded. Glass rained across the floor. The wooden chair burst into splinters without warning. They pressed forward, chanting, praying, driving whatever remained out. And for a moment it worked. The room went still. Calm. Peaceful, but peace is often just silence before the scream. At exactly 3 a.m., the house awakened. Every window shattered at once. Lights surged, then went dark. The front door blew open with a bang, and something walked in. A presence, not seen, but felt. It passed between them like a gust of hatred. Father Nolan was thrown against the wall, his head cracking the plaster. Keen dropped to his knees, blinded by a sudden flash of pain behind his eyes. And in that moment, he felt it. A mind not his own. A pressure in his skull. A voice in his blood. "You are next." Keen awoke on the floor at dawn. Father Nolan lay unconscious beside him. The attic door was gone. Burned away. They left that morning. The church closed the case. The house was marked unfit for occupancy. The records were sealed. But Father Keen never returned to the priesthood. He tried to move on. He wrote everything down. He shared his notes with one other person, Chris McNeil. Years later, she received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single tape. A recording labeled 3 o'clock a.m. Georgetown House. She played it once. Just once. It began with silence. Then the knocking. Tap-a-tap-tap. Then breathing. And finally Regan's voice. Or something that sounded like her. "Mommy, he's back." The scratches under her skin. For a while, it seemed the horror had ended. Chris McNeil, exhausted and broken, but fiercely protective, had taken Regan far from Washington, D.C. They moved into a quiet home in the outskirts of Los Angeles, tucked away in the hills behind Mulholland Drive, surrounded by trees and sunlight. It felt like a second chance. Regan had no memory of what happened in Georgetown, or so she said. The doctors explained the amnesia as a defense mechanism, a psychological shield. Chris didn't push. She wanted to believe her daughter was healing, that whatever evil had taken root in her soul was gone. But trauma leaves residue, and demons rarely leave quietly. It began subtly. At first, Chris noticed scratches on Regan's arms after school. Little marks then. Red lines barely more than paper cuts. She assumed it was nothing. Kids roughhousing. Maybe Regan had brushed against branches walking home. But then they started appearing in places that didn't make sense. Behind her knees, across her back, even on the soles of her feet. And Regan never felt them happen. They'd simply appear. One morning, Chris found a word carved into Regan's side, just beneath her ribcage. 3 letters, L-I-E. Blood still fresh. Regan was fast asleep. Chris rushed her to the hospital. The doctors asked questions. Was there self-harm, abuse at school, emotional trauma? Regan shook her head. "I don't remember. I don't even feel them." Chris tried everything. She removed sharp objects from Regan's room. She installed cameras. She began checking her body every night before bed. Nothing. But by morning, the scratches were always there, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, sometimes words, sometimes symbols. One night, Chris stayed awake beside Regan, watching her sleep. Around 2:50 a.m., Regan stirred. She groaned softly, twisting under the covers. Chris leaned in. Suddenly, Regan's back arched, and her skin began to ripple as if something moved just beneath it. And then, right before her eyes, long red lines tore themselves into her daughter's skin. There were no hands, no weapons, nothing visible. Just skin splitting open from the inside. Chris screamed. Regan sat bolt upright, eyes wide, mouth open, but no sound came out. Then she collapsed, unconscious. The doctors were baffled. One called it dermatographic urticaria, a rare skin condition where pressure causes welts or scratches. Chris wanted to believe him, but then the words came back. One morning, Regan lifted her shirt and showed Chris her abdomen. Scrawled across her stomach in fresh, angry cuts were for words. "He still sees you." Chris contacted Father Nolan. He had worked with Father Keen during the final cleansing of the Georgetown house. If anyone understood what might still be lingering, it was him. She didn't want to believe it was starting again. But in her heart, she knew. When Nolan arrived, he took one look at the scratches and paled. "These aren't random," he said. "These are messages." He held Regan's wrist gently. "Has anything strange happened recently? Dreams, feelings?" Regan hesitated, then nodded. "I hear breathing. At night, right next to my bed." Chris's breath caught in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" Regan looked down. "Because if I say it out loud, I think he'll know I remember." That night, Nolan stayed with them. He placed blessed objects in Regan's room: crucifixes, prayer cards, holy water. He whispered the St. Michael prayer at her door. Chris watched from the hallway, clutching a photo of Regan from before it all began, before the voices, the screams, the shadows. Around 3 a.m., Regan screamed. Chris and Nolan rushed in. Regan was writhing on the bed, as if something was crawling inside her. The crucifix on the wall spun violently before being flung across the room. Blood poured from her arms-long gashes etched in spirals and crosses. Nolan grabbed the holy water. "In nomen patris, et filii, et spiritus sancti." Regan shrieked. "You're too late." The voice was not hers. It was deeper, older, and it came from her stomach. Literally, her stomach. Chris watched, horrified, as a mouth seemed to form beneath her navel, opening in a scream of its own. Then it vanished. Regan collapsed, unconscious once again. The next morning, Nolan examined her skin. No fresh cuts, no bruises, but her eyes had changed. They were darker, the whites tinged with yellow. The irises seemed to pulse, just slightly, like something was watching from within. Regan wouldn't speak, not a word. She simply sat on the couch, staring out the window, at nothing. Chris begged Nolan, "Is it a possession? Is it him again?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "I don't think he ever left. He just buried himself." Chris shook her head, but she was fine, for weeks. He waited. Evil is patient, especially when it wants to stay. Regan began drawing again. Pictures of shadow men with open mouths and no eyes. Figures standing at the end of hallways. Shapes with twisted limbs crawling from her closet. One night, Chris found a new drawing on her pillow. It was of herself, eyes gouged out, a demon's tail wrapped around her throat. On the back, written in red crayon, "He said you lied." Chris wept. Nolan contacted the archdiocese. They sent a team this time, quiet, careful, experienced. They asked questions, collected photos, interviewed Regan and Chris. They wanted to be sure it wasn't psychological. They wanted proof. They got it. On the 7th night, they installed a thermal camera. Chris, Nolan, and Regan all stayed in one room, sleeping lightly. At exactly 3:02 a.m., the camera began to record intense heat fluctuations like a human body walking through the room. But no one was moving. Then, Regan sat up slowly, her back arched, her hands clenched into claws, and her skin began to cut itself again, this time in front of 3 witnesses. The words bled onto her chest. "Let me in." Regan's eyes rolled back. She screamed, voice layered one scream atop another. And then, silence. She fell back asleep. The wounds disappeared within minutes. Gone. Healed. The Vatican was notified. They approved a second exorcism. This time, under strict secrecy. The McNeils were moved to a private religious facility in Northern California, monastery built on land long considered sacred, protected, and isolated. Regan was placed in a chamber lined with holy icons. Father Nolan, along with 2 new priests, began preparing. Regan remained quiet. She didn't speak, eat, or cry, but she scratched, constantly. Her arms, her legs, her neck. Not aggressively, just idly, like something beneath her skin etched constantly. She whispered to herself. Sometimes, they caught phrases. "He promised he'd stop. I didn't mean to ask questions. Don't tell them I remember. The scratches worsened. They bled without warning. Sometimes her skin burned to the touch. Sometimes it froze. One night, the words returned. Across her entire torso, deep and red. You let me in. I never left. Chris nearly collapsed when she saw it. The priests began the ritual at dawn. They prayed. They chanted. They cried out to heaven. And in return, something answered. But it wasn't human. And it wasn't done yet. She knows things she shouldn't. The wind outside the monastery howled like a living thing. Within the thick stone walls of the prayer chamber, 3 priests continued their work. Father Nolan stood at the foot of Regan's bed, voice hoarse from hours of prayer. The other 2, Father Harlan and Father Vicente, alternated between reading scripture and monitoring the girl's vitals. Regan had been under observation for almost 4 days now, showing signs of both possession and something worse, knowledge that shouldn't have been hers. Chris McNeil sat nearby, pale, drained, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Regan hadn't spoken in her normal voice since the first ritual attempt began. When she did speak, the voice was layered, unnatural, sometimes ancient, sometimes chillingly childlike. But more disturbing than how she spoke was what she said. It began with small things. Father Harlan asked her, calmly, "Do you know where you are, Regan?" She didn't lift her head, didn't blink. She whispered, "You were 14 when your brother drowned." Harlan froze. He hadn't spoken about that in years, not to anyone. It was a family tragedy he carried like a scar deep in his soul. "Who told you that?" he asked, swallowing hard. Regan tilted her head, her eyes gleaming. "He screamed for you, but you were too far, too slow." Nolan stepped in, placing a hand on Harlan's shoulder. "Don't engage," he warned softly. "It's not her." Regan smirked. "Isn't it?" Later that night, Chris returned to the room after a brief rest. Regan turned her head toward her mother and said, "You remember that night in Milan? The red wine? The man in the leather jacket?" Chris stopped in her tracks. She had been in Milan, just once, years ago. The man was someone she'd never told anyone. A Buddha brief, passionate mistake. Not even her closest friends knew. Regan sat up slightly. "He said he loved you, but he didn't. He never even told you his real name." Chris's lips trembled. "Regan, how do you know that?" Regan didn't answer. Instead, she began humming. It was the song that had played that night on the hotel radio. A jazz tune, obscure, old. One Chris hadn't heard since that night. Nolan made the sign of the cross. The entity is using her as a conduit. It's reading thoughts, memories, possibly even the soul. "But why?" Chris whispered. "Because it wants to break you." Over the following days, Regan revealed more. Secrets no child could know, hidden sins, guilts buried deep. She turned to Father Vicente during prayer and said, "You lied to your parish. About the money. About the woman." Vicente paled. "I never." "Yes, you did," Regan interrupted. "Don't worry. She forgave you. But your God, he's still deciding." When they tried to ignore her, she would begin speaking in Latin, then Spanish, then tongues. But always, she circled back to knowing the cruel catalog of private shame. She told the head nurse that her father had died not from cancer, as she claimed, but suicide. She told the groundskeeper that the child he'd never met, one from the affair, had died in a fire just 2 years prior. Every word she said turned out to be true. They verified what they could. Some records were found. Some were confirmed by phone. Others were impossible to probe but still hit their targets like poisoned darts. And every time someone broke tears, anger, Daniel Reagan would smile faintly and mutter, "He told me. He shows me everything." Father Nolan began documenting every session, not just in writing, but on tape and film. He interviewed Chris privately. "She's never had access to this kind of information," he confirmed. "No," Chris said. "No social media. No eavesdropping. And certainly not obscure Italian jazz songs." He nodded grimly. It's deeper than possession. This is something connected. A tether between realms, a parasite with perfect memory. One morning, they found Regan standing in the center of the prayer room. She had carved something into the stone wall. With her fingernails, a sentence, "Your secrets are my skin now." Her hands bled. Her nails were cracked to the quick, but she didn't wince, didn't speak, just stared at the wall. Father Harlan approached cautiously. "Do you know what you're writing?" Regan turned slowly and said in a cold whisper, "You still think God is listening?" Then she laughed. They began testing her, asking questions only specific people could answer. Father Nolan asked, "What is the name of the child I lost before she was born?" Regan whispered, "Anna." "Correct." Chris asked, "What did my father whisper to me when he passed?" Regan replied, "I'm sorry I wasn't better." Chris broke down. Every answer was a wound reopened. But it wasn't just people in the room. Regan spoke of things happening outside the monastery. She described a plane crash in Eastern Europe to minutes before the emergency broadcast reported it. She named a politician's affair before the press scandal broke. She told Chris, in terrifying calm, "There's a man watching this place. He's wearing a black jacket and holding a broken rosary." That same evening, security spotted a man matching the description standing across the road from the gate. He vanished before they could question him. By the fifth night, Regan stopped sleeping. She sat upright in her bed, eyes wide open, skin pale, lips whispering constantly. Chris begged the priests to let her rest. Nolan insisted on observation. "We're close," he said. "We just need to understand how much of her is left." Chris clutched her daughter's hand. "I don't care about understanding. I just want her back." That night, Regan spoke in her own voice. "Mom." Chris blinked. "Regan, baby, is that you?" Regan looked confused, afraid. "Where are we?" Chris burst into tears. "You're safe now, honey. You're here. You're with me." But then Regan's head tilted. She grinned and whispered, "Almost had you." The room exploded with force. Books flew from shelves. Chairs overturned. Candles blew out. A gust of wind knocked Chris back. The priests rushed in, chanting loudly. As Regan floated into the air, arms stretched unnaturally. The voice spoke again, echoing, layered. "You think you can unknow what you know? She's mine now. Her mind is a library, and I am the only reader." Chris screamed, "Leave her alone." Regan's body dropped, limp. They took shifts watching her round the clock. But it was too late. Regan had seen too much. She spoke less now. Just watched, listened. But her drawings grew darker. Not just demons but eyes. Eyes, hundreds of them, drawn on every surface, walls, pages, even the floor beneath her bed. She labeled them. Each one had a name. Some biblical, some ancient, some not even in recognizable language. Chris asked, "What do they mean?" Regan said softly, "They're the ones watching me, the ones he showed me." That evening, she looked at Nolan and said, "There are 13 of them, you only faced one." Nolan stiffened. "What do you mean?" Regan tilted her head. "Each one holds a key to a door you haven't opened yet." Chris's hands trembled. "Is that what this is, a door?" Regan nodded. "I'm the lock." On the 7th day, Regan drew something new. A circle, an altar, a man in robes kneeling before a shadow shaped like a beast. Underneath, in small letters, she wrote. He tried to bind it. He failed. Father Vicenti recognized the drawing. He pulled Nolan aside. "That's the old ritual, the binding from the 1400s, forbidden now." "How does she know it?" Vicenti swallowed. "She shouldn't. No one alive does." At 3 a.m., Regan sat up again. She pointed at each priest in the room. "You," she said to Harlan, "will never believe. You, to Vicenti, will doubt until the moment you see it. And you," she turned to Nolan, "will die trying to stop it." Chris shouted, "Enough." Regan looked at her, sadly. "I'm sorry, Mom. I tried not to know. but he keeps showing me. Chris knelt beside her. What's he showing you? Regan leaned forward and whispered. What comes next? Eyes in the corner of the room. Chris MacNeil hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time since the second exorcism began. Her body ached, her mind felt stretched, frayed, and worn thin like old cloth. She lived now in a constant state of waiting for the next scream. The next voice that wasn't Regan's. The next impossible thing to claw its way into reality. The monastery had a kind of uneasy stillness. The stone walls were thick, the halls cold. And though it was a place of worship, it no longer felt safe. Holy water burned out faster than candles. Crucifixes cracked on the walls without warning. Rosaries snapped in the middle of prayer. Chris couldn't remember the last time she heard Regan laugh. That night, exhaustion finally overwhelmed her. She fell asleep in the small cot beside Regan's room, wrapped in an old blanket, a cross gripped in her fist. It was just after 3 a.m. when she woke with a start. Not to a noise, but to silency, an unnatural kind that pressed in on all sides. Her eyes fluttered open, and there it was, in the corner of the room. Something watching. It didn't move. It didn't blink, but it was there. 2 eyes, glowing faintly, as if reflecting light that wasn't in the room. They hovered in the darkness near the ceiling, just above the cabinet where Regan kept her sketchbooks. Chris sat up, pulse pounding, heart thudding in her chest. She blinked once. Still there. The shape surrounding the eyes was vague like smoke, like the suggestion of something with limbs. But it never resolved fully into view. Just the eyes, staring. She slowly reached for the lamp on the bedside table. The moment her fingers touched the switch, the eyes disappeared. She turned the light on. Nothing. No movement. No shadow in the corner. Just dust and old wood. She stood and moved toward the corner cautiously, pushing aside the curtain, scanning the walls. "Hello," she whispered. Her voice felt too loud in the silence. No response. Just a faint smell, burned hair and sulfur. Her hand shook as she picked up Regan's sketchbook. On the last page was a drawing she hadn't seen before. It was the corner of the room, and in the corner 2 red eyes. Beneath them, written in the smallest handwriting Regan had ever used. "He's in the corner when you sleep." Chris ran to find Father Nolan. When she burst into the priest's quarters, he was already awake, seated at the edge of his bed, staring into space. "I saw something," she gasped, "in Regan's room. It was watching me." He looked at her, pale. "I believe you." He reached beside his bed and pulled out a black-bound journal. On the open page was a drawing 2 red eyes. "I've been seeing them too." Chris stepped back. "What does it mean?" Nolan exhaled slowly. "They're not just watching, they're waiting." That morning, Regan refused to speak. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She didn't acknowledge Chris or the priests. She sat at the edge of her bed, sketching compulsive life after page filled with eyes. Some wide and human, others slitted, reptilian, some too large, some impossibly small. When Chris touched her hand, Regan flinched. "Sweetheart, it's me." Regan didn't lift her head. Instead, she whispered, "Don't stand in that corner." Chris froze. "Why?" Regan's voice trembled. "Because that's where he's most real." Father Vicenti placed protective seals on the Florentian symbols. Prayers written in Latin and Greek, placed beneath the bed, around the windows, across the threshold. "Eyes are one of the oldest signs of a watcher," he explained. "In every culture, they represent the presence of something beyond the veil." Chris nodded, her voice weak. "But why us? Why her?" Nolan answered gently. "Because once you've opened the door, some things never stop looking in." That night, Chris refused to sleep. She sat upright in the chair beside Regan, coffee in hand, eyes locked on the dark corner of the room. For hours, nothing happened. The candle flickered gently. Regan slept. But then, right as the clock struck 3 a.m., the candle extinguished. No wind. No movement. just gone. And slowly the eyes returned. First one, then the second. Hovering, watching. Chris didn't blink. "Show yourself," she whispered. "What are you?" No answer. The air grew colder. The hairs on her arms rose. She stood, walked forward, slowly. The closer she got to the corner, the more her body felt wrong, like her organs had shifted slightly out of place. Her bones ached. Her teeth throbbed. But she kept going, until she was face to face with the eyes. They blinked, once, and then a mouth formed beneath them, long, grinning, stretching from shadow to shadow. And it spoke. "I was here before she was born." Chris's legs buckled. She fell to her knees, gasping. "Leave her alone." The voice hissed. "She invited me. She asks me to stay." Chris shouted, "Liar." But deep down something twisted, because part of her remembered Regan's voice, years ago, whispering into her pillow after the first incident. "I just want a friend who doesn't leave." Suddenly, the mouth vanished. The eyes snapped shut. Regan screamed. Chris turned and ran to the bed. Regan thrashed, clawing at her own eyes, sobbing. "He's showing me again. He won't stop." Chris held her tight. "It's okay. I'm here." Regan's voice turned cold. "No, you're not. He is." Chris pulled back. Regan's eyes opened. They were glowing red. Not entirely, but around the edges, like something was leaking through. Then just as quickly, it was gone. She collapsed into her mother's arms. The priests rushed in seconds later. Regan was unconscious. Chris was trembling. "The eyes," she whispered. "They're real." Nolan placed a hand on her shoulder. "I believe you." Vicente looked around the room, jaw tight. "It's growing stronger. It's using the girl to manifest. But it needs something." "Like what?" Chris asked. "Attention, belief, fear." Over the next few days, the eyes began appearing in more places. Drawn on the mirrors, etched into stone, carved into candles, even photographed. Nolan took a Polaroid in Regan's room during the day. When it developed, there they were, hovering in the top left corner of the image, to red shapes, unmistakable. Vicente took another photo. Same result. They tried it in Chris's room. Same. "It's spreading," Vicente whispered. Chris began to feel it even when she wasn't in the room. Walking down the hall, eating in the mess, even showering. That feeling like being watched from the darkest corner. It never left. One night, she passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of them. Just a flash, but it was enough to send her screaming. By the end of the week, Regan was no longer speaking at all, just drawing. But not just eyes now. Doors, always with the same symbol above theme and eye, inside a circle, surrounded by flame. When asked what it meant, she finally whispered, "Where he came through." Chris clutched the drawing. "What door?" Regan's voice was distant, the one in the corner. They began researching, digging through old church records, and they found it. A journal from the 1600s, written by a monk who claimed to witness a doorway that bleeds, marked by the eyes of a watcher. The journal described the same flame-ringed eye, the same shadows, the same whispers. They called it the Chamber of Manifest. Not a place, not a thing, but a condition. A point in space where something crossed over. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. The corner in Regan's room wasn't just haunted. It was a door, and it was open. Nolan decided that night to seal it. They prepared a ritual blessing of the four corners. Ancient, dangerous, rarely used. The room was cleared. Salt was poured in a perfect square. Incense burned. Latin prayers echoed. And when they reached the northern corner, Regan's Kernerth candle flared violently. The air turned black. The eyes opened. Huge. Wider than before. Everyone dropped to their knees. Chris couldn't breathe. A voice filled the room. She opened it with loneliness. You tried to close it with lies. The walls cracked. The seal burst. And then, silence. The eyes vanished. The candle went out. And Regan stood in the center of the room, unharmed. She looked up at her mother, tears in her eyes. "I saw him, Mom." Chris held her breath. "Who?" Regan whispered. "The one behind all the others. The room that freezes." The door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the walls. The temperature dropped instantly. Chris could see her own breath cloud in the air as she rushed to Regan's bedside. Her daughter was curled into herself, arms wrapped tightly around her chest, teeth chattering. The heavy wool blankets that had covered her just minutes ago were now soaked through with frost. Frost inside a sealed room, in summer, in California. Father Nolan stepped in after Chris, pulling his coat tighter. He held a small thermometer and glanced at it. 32 degrees, exactly freezing, he muttered, eyebrows knitting. Father Vicente followed, holding a brass crucifix in one hand and a vial of blessed oil in the other. "This is it. This is the beginning of the true manifestation." Chris turned to him, panicked. She said she saw the one behind all the others. Nolan nodded grimly. "And now he's making his presence known." That night marked the first time the church officially declared the room as a manifest site. Not haunted, not cursed active, alive in a way that no room should ever be. The monastery sealed off the hallway. Only Chris and the priests were allowed inside. Within minutes of closing the door behind them, everything changed. The windows fogged from the inside. The air turned heavy, too thick to breathe normally. A crucifix that had been secured to the wall with 3 screws wrenched itself free and clattered to the floor. No one touched it. There were no vibrations, just a sudden, deliberate drop. Chris picked it up with trembling hands. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Father Vicente didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "It means he's claiming the space." Regan didn't speak much anymore. She was awake, but distant, eyes wide, locked on something no one else could see. Sometimes she whispered numbers, sometimes phrases in languages no one recognized. The words came too fast, too fluid, to be from a child's imagination. Father Nolan began recording everything. The falling temperature, the way objects moved slowly, as though tugged by invisible strings, the way the light bulbs flickered whenever Regan blinked. It was all documented, but documentation didn't protect them. By the third night, the frost had spread to the walls. Chris reached out to touch the window frame and recoiled. Her fingers turned white instantly, as though burned by cold. "Feel that," she said. Nolan tried. He winced. "That's not natural cold." Vicente agreed. "This is spiritual temperature. Demonic cold. It's not coming from the outside, it's coming from him." They tried bringing in space heaters, even industrial-grade ones. They failed. The room rejected them. The power surged and failed every time someone plugged one in. But more disturbing than the cold was what began to appear on the frost. Symbols, handprints, faces. They started small, a smudge here, a strange marking there. Then Regan began pointing to them. "They're watching," she whispered. Chris stared at the wall. A handprint, frozen solid, slowly slid upward. "Watching from where?" Nolan asked her. Regan's lips trembled. "From below." The fourth night, all the crosses fell. At the same time, 14 of them in the walls, around the bed, even the one Chris wore around her neck. They hit the ground with a terrible clang, echoing like bells in a tomb. Regan screamed, not in pain but rage. She threw herself upright, eyes wild, hair sticking to her face. "You can't stop him," she shrieked. Chris rushed forward. "Baby, it's okay. I'm here." Regan's head snapped toward her, but her eyes were not her own. Black, endless. "No, you're not." Chris fell back. Nolan stepped forward, holy water in hand. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke you." Regan snarled, not like a child, like an animal. Then her body went limp. She awoke the next morning with no memory of it. "Did something happen?" she asked softly. Chris hesitated. "No, honey, you were just sleeping." But Regan looked at her mother carefully. "No, I wasn't." The frost got thicker. By the 5th day, a thin sheet of ice had formed over the walls. Nolan scraped at it with a bladder. Beneath it were more symbols. Writings in ancient scripts: Hebrew, Aramaic, Babylonian, even one they couldn't identify at all. Vicente traced it with his gloved finger. "It's a summoning language, a gate." Chris swallowed. "A gate to what?" No one answered. The room itself began to react to prayer. Vicente read from the Book of Psalms, and the lights dimmed. Nolan held up a crucifix, and the ice cracked, spiderwebbing behind him. Regan screamed again, that night body arching off the bed. Blood poured from her nose and ears. Her breath fogged the room with each word. "He's almost here. I can feel him in my bones." Chris held her as tight as she could. She was so cold, like holding a child made of snow. By the 6th night, it was no longer safe to leave Regan alone, even for a minute. Chris stayed in the room, wrapped in blankets, trembling beside her daughter. Nolan and Vicente took turns rotating in and out, offering prayers of protection. They couldn't warm the room, but they could keep the shadows back barely. But then something happened they hadn't seen before. Regan started to freeze. It began with her fingers, blue at the tips, then her toes, then her lips. Her skin turned pale, like porcelain, her body temps dropping. Nolan said urgently, "It's like the cold is inside her now." They tried to warm her with blankets, warm water, even their own body heat. Nothing worked. Chris sobbed, rocking her child. "Don't go to him. Please, stay with me." Regan opened her eyes. Tears ran down her cheeks and turned to ice. "I'm not doing this, Mom," she whispered. "He is." The temperature hit 23 degrees. Inside, the frost was an inch thick now, crackling underfoot. The priests considered moving her. "I don't think the room will let us," Vicente warned. "We try, and we might trigger something worse." Chris refused to leave. "If she's going to freeze," she said, "then I'm going to freeze with her." That night, Nolan made a desperate decision. A ritual long banned by the modern church. The old fire prayer, a direct challenge to the invading entity. It required candles, oil, and the risk of setting the entire room ablaze. But it was fire or ice, and ice was already winning. They began at midnight. Vicente drew a protective circle with oil. Nolan placed for candles around Regan's bed. Chris held her daughter's hand as the flames were lit. The room groaned as though in pain. Cracks formed in the frost-deep ones, jagged and wide. The temperature rose just slightly, but then the candles blew out. All four. A low sound began to echo. Not from Regan, not from the room, but from beneath the floor. A rumble, a growl, something moving beneath the monastery itself. And then, a voice, low, inhuman. Too late. She opened the door, and I am already in. The ice shattered. Every window exploded outward. The crucifixes burst into splinters. The temperature shot back up, but not to warmth, to heat. Blistering, suffocating heat. Steam rose off Regan's body as the frost melted instantly. Chris covered her daughter as the flames danced in the corners of the room, not from their candles, from the air itself. "Back!" Nolan cried. "Get back!" But Chris didn't move. She just held Regan and whispered, "I'm still here. I'll always be here." Sudden silence. The flames vanished. The heat faded, and the room returned to freezing. Regan stirred. Her eyes opened. "Is he gone?" she asked softly. Chris stroked her hair. "No, sweetheart. But we're still fighting." Regan nodded, and closed her eyes again. This time, not in terror, but in sleep. The room didn't warm. The frost never left. But that night, for the first time in weeks, Regan slept through the night, and the eyes in the corner didn't return. But the priests knew better. They weren't gone, just waiting. And the room that Frazu was only the beginning. The holy water test. The monastery felt heavier than ever, like the very air was thickened by something unseen and malevolent. Chris McNeil paced the narrow hallway outside Regan's room, wringing her hands. Her daughter lay inside, motionless, but the room remained cold, brittle frost clinging stubbornly to the stone walls. Father Nolan and Father Vicente entered, carrying a small silver bowl and a bottle of holy water. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the monastery's old heating system, struggling against the unnatural cold. Nolan spoke quietly. "We must test the waters again, this time. I'm not sure we can trust what we see." Vicente nodded grimly. "Last time, the entity mimicked everything perfectly. If it can fake water, it can fake salvation." Chris's heart pounded. She felt like she was on the edge of something terrible, something she couldn't control. Inside Regan's room, the girl lay on the bed, pale and still. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The priests placed the silver bowl on the bedside table, filling it with the water from the bottle, clear, shimmering, blessed. Nolan lifted a small vial and poured a few drops of the water over Regan's forehead. The reaction was immediate. Regan's body jerked violently. She screamed a sound not her own. It was guttural, raw, filled with rage and pain. Her hands clenched the bed covers, nails digging deep into the fabric. Chris rushed to her side, holding her trembling daughter close. "She's hurting," Chris whispered, tears streaming down her face. Vicente stepped forward, raising a crucifix in front of Regan's face. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, be gone," he commanded. Regan's scream grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. Then something strange happened. The water in the silver bowl began to ripple, darken. It turned thick black, almost oily. Nolan recoiled, eyes wide. "It's a counterfeit," he breathed. "This water isn't holy." Chris stared at the bowl, confused. She had seen the bottle's seal. It was blessed. How could the water be fake? Vicente grabbed the bottle and checked it. Suddenly, his face paled. The seal was intact, but the liquid inside was warm, unnaturally so. "Someone's been tampering with this," he said. Nolan exchanged a glance with him. "If it's not holy water, then what is it?" At that moment, Regan's body convulsed again. Her eyes snapped open, black as midnight. She hissed, "The water lies, the water burns." Chris felt bile rise in her throat. "Why are you doing this to her?" she cried. Regan's head twisted unnaturally to the side. "It is not me, it is him, the liar." Nolan took a deep breath. "We have to test again," he said, pulling a second vial from his robe. "This is fresh holy water, consecrated only minutes ago." He poured the new water over Regan's forehead. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the scream returned. Louder, more piercing. The girl writhed violently. The blackened water in the bowl bubbled, steam rising. A harsh voice boomed from Regan's mouth. "You think your tricks will fool me? I am beyond your feeble symbols." Chris clutched her chest, sobbing. "How long will this last?" she asked. Nolan answered quietly. "As long as she lets him, and as long as he feeds on her fear." The priests continued the ritual, sprinkling holy water over Regan's hands, feet, and chest. Each time, the reaction intensified. Regan screamed, spat foul words, and her body convulsed like a puppet on broken strings. At one point, she lunged toward Vicente, growling, "You are blind. You cannot see the truth." Vicente stepped back, crucifix raised. Nolan began chanting louder. Suddenly, Regan's body froze mid-scream. Her eyes locked onto the bowl. The water inside shimmered, then erupted. A black vapor shot upward, filling the room. Chris coughed, covering her mouth. Nolan and Vicente crossed themselves repeatedly. The vapor coalesced into a figure, a shadowy form with glowing red eyes. It hissed, "You cannot cleanse what is already corrupted." Chris felt ice crawl up her spine. The entity wasn't hiding anymore. It was showing itself unasked, Vicente sprinkled the last drops of holy water onto the vapor. It screamed an unearthly, soul-piercing sound and vanished. Regan collapsed back onto the bed, breathing heavily. The room grew still. Chris held Regan's hand tightly. "She's safe," Nolan assured her, "for now." Vicente added, "But the test showed us the truth. This entity can mimic holy things, water, symbols, even voices." Chris swallowed hard. "How do we fight something like that?" Nolan shook his head. "We fight with faith stronger than any trick it can use." Over the next days, they repeated the holy water tests. Always fresh water, blessed immediately before use. Each time, Regan's reaction was fierce. The entity screamed through her, but the water never corrupted. The black vapor never returned. Chris noticed a slight change after each test. Regan seemed a little less burdened. The blackness in her eyes faded. The scratches on her skin became less frequent. But the entity was clever. It adapted. Between tests, Regan's whispers grew louder. She spoke in riddles, hints of things to come. "She calls him the liar," Nolan said one evening. "The deceiver." Chris asked, "Is there a way to force him out?" Nolan looked grave. "Only if Regan wills it." One night, Chris found Regan awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I'm tired, Mom," she whispered. Chris sat beside her. "You're so brave." Regan smiled faintly. "But the fight is far from over." The priests planned the next steps. A full exorcism, more powerful and longer than before. Using not just holy water, but sacred relics, prayers, and faith. Chris steeled herself. She would stand by Regan until the end. The holy water test revealed the demon's strength, but also its weakness. Faith, truth, and the will to resist. Voices from below. The monastery was unusually quiet that evening. Even the old stone walls seemed to hold their breath as Chris McNeil sat alone in the dimly lit room where Regan had been confined for weeks. The frost still lingered stubbornly on the edges of the window panes, a lingering sign of the unseen cold that haunted the girl's chamber. Chris was exhausted. Between watching her daughter and dealing with the priests, the heavy weight of fear and uncertainty pressed on her every moment. But tonight, there was something new, something that had the potential to change everything. Father Nolan had returned from a trip to the nearby town, bringing with him a small digital recorder. It was meant to capture any unusual sounds, voices, or phenomena during the long nights when the priests could not be present in Regan's room. Father Vicente had set up the device carefully, placing it near the bed where Regan often whispered to herself, sometimes in languages none of them understood. Chris leaned forward as Nolan pressed the play button. The recording started with soft, uneven breathing. Regan's voice came first, weak, childlike, hesitant. "Mom, I'm scared." Then, beneath her words, faint sounds began to emerge. Whispered words, too low to be caught clearly at first. A subtle, almost rhythmic murmur that grew steadily more distinct. Chris's hand tightened around the armrest as the whispers intensified. "They're below us, beneath the floor, waiting," Regan said in a tone that was no longer entirely her own. Suddenly, the voice changed. It became layered, guttural, distorted, a voice ancient and full of malevolence. "You called us in, we answer." Chris gasped. Nolan quickly paused the recording. "What did you hear?" Chris asked, her voice barely a whisper. Father Nolan looked grave. "This is different. The voices are not just in her mind, they are coming from somewhere beneath the monastery itself." The priests agreed that the recordings were proof of something terrifying. The entity or entities occupying Regan's body were connected to something ancient and buried below them. But what? That night, the three adults gathered in the monastery's library to pore over old maps and records. Between the yellowed pages and faded ink, they discovered something alarming. Beneath the monastery, long before it had become a place of worship, there had been catacombs, secret tunnels used centuries ago to hide forbidden texts and relics during times of persecution. Rumors told of a chamber deep underground known only as the Hollow, where dark rites were performed in the shadows. Father Vicente ran his fingers over the brittle parchment. If what the voices say is true, then the entity in Regan is linked to this chamber, to whatever was summoned or bound there. Chris swallowed hard. How do we find it? Nolan nodded toward a faint drawing of a labyrinthine underground. We must go beneath the monastery. The next day, armed with flashlights and holy relics, the group descended through a narrow trapdoor hidden in the library floor. The air grew colder, heavier, as they navigated twisting stone corridors. The walls bore scratches and strange symbols matching the ones Regan had drawn on her sketchbooks. "Listen," Nolan whispered. From far below came a faint, chilling sound. Low voices chanting in tongues neither of them recognized. The priests crossed themselves and moved cautiously forward. In the deepest chamber, they found a circular altar carved from black stone. The surface was cracked and worn, but an unmistakable symbol was etched into it, an eye surrounded by a ring of flames. Vicente knelt, tracing the carving. "This is the same symbol Regan drew Dora's mark." Suddenly, the recorder Nolan carried began to emit static. From the device came Regan's voice once again, faint but clear. "She's afraid. She says they are coming up." The ground trembled lightly beneath their feet. Suddenly, the chamber flooded with an unnatural darkness. The priest's flashlights flickered and died. Only the faint glow of the symbol remained visible. From the shadows, whispered voices swirled. "We come through the cracks. We are the Watchers, the Eternal Ones." Chris clutched her rosary desperately. The voices grew louder, overlapping, as if many beings spoke at once. Regan's voice emerged again, this time pleading, "Help me, don't let them take me." Father Nolan lit a candle from his lighter. Its flame flickered violently as the voices became a roar. Vicente began to pray louder, reciting exorcism rites. The darkness thinned briefly, revealing shadowy shapes circling the altar. Hundreds of glowing eyes stared from the gloom. Chris's heart pounded. "Who are you?" she called out, voice trembling. The answer came in a voice both beautiful and terrible. "We are the Forgotten, the Watchers beneath the world. You disturbed our rest." The voices recited a warning. The girl opened the gate. The door must remain closed, or the darkness will spread. Nolan took a deep breath. "We will seal the door." Back in Regan's room, the cold had intensified. The frost glittered thicker on the walls. Regan whispered, eyes half closed, "They are near." Chris held her hand tightly. "Stay with me, baby." The girl's breath was shallow. "I hear them below." The priests prepared a ritual to seal the gate beneath the monastery. It would require strength, faith, and the unity of all present. As they chanted, the voices from the recorder echoed faintly through the monastery's stones. "You cannot bind us forever." The ground shook. The temperature plunged. Chris looked at Regan, now pale but calm. "Mom," the girl whispered, "I'm ready." The voices faded as the ritual reached its climax. A final prayer was spoken. The symbol on the altar glowed once more, then cracked and shattered. The temperature slowly rose in the chamber. The voices fell silent. The darkness lifted. Back upstairs, Regan's eyes opened fully. The frost began to melt. Her voice was clear. "I am free." Chris wept, but deep down a whisper lingered below the floor, in the shadows. The Watchers were not gone, only silenced for now. "I am many." The air was thick with tension. The room felt smaller than ever, as if the shadows themselves were pressing in on Chris McNeil and the priests. Regan lay on the bed, pale and still, her eyes closed, but the silence was anything but peaceful. It was the kind of silence that screamed. Father Nolan held the crucifix close to Regan's face, while Father Vicente prepared the incense. Chris stood nearby, trembling but determined. Suddenly, Regan's eyes snapped open. They were not just black anymore, they shimmered. swirling with an unnatural storm of darkness and flickering lights. As if many souls were trapped behind her gaze, a voice echoed from Regan's throat, deep and mocking. "I am many." Chris's heart stopped. Nolan took a step forward. "Who are you?" The voice chuckled, a sound cold and cruel. "You may call me Legion." Legion. The word hung in the room like a dark cloud. Chris remembered the old storyist name given to demons, who claimed to possess many spirits in one body. "It is true," the voice continued. "I am many. I am the host of those you fear. The endless whisper in the dark, the shadow behind your prayers." Vicenti made the sign of the cross and began to chant softly. Legion laughed again, louder this time. "Your prayers are weak, your faith fragile. You cannot touch me. I have danced through centuries, worn many faces, broken many souls." Chris swallowed hard, clenching her fists. "Why Regan?" she demanded. "Why her?" The voice shifted, softer now, almost mocking pity. "Because she called. Because she invited me in. Because loneliness and fear are keys no door can resist." Regan's lips moved, but the words were not her own. "I am Legion, for we are many." The room darkened. The temperature dropped again. A breeze swept through, though no windows were open. Candles flickered, shadows riffed. Chris felt as if the walls were alive, breathing. Nolan stepped forward, raising the crucifix higher. "By the power of Christ, I command you of this child." The voice sneered. "You command nothing. I am Legion. We are Legion." Suddenly, Regan's head twisted unnaturally, and her voice became a chorus of many tones, overlapping, chaotic. "We are the darkness in your light, the fear in your heart, the truth you deny." Chris stepped closer, voice steady despite the terror inside. "Regan, fight it. You are stronger." For a moment, silence. Then a whisper, barely audible. "She fights, but we are many." Vicenti sprinkled holy water, which sizzled upon touching Regan's skin. The dark storm in her eyes flickered. A shadowy figure seemed to rise behind her, a vague mass of shifting shapes. Nolan grabbed Regan's hand and began reciting the ancient exorcism prayer. The entity roared in anger, shaking the room. "You think a prayer can bind us? We are Legion. We are eternal." Chris felt tears stream down her face. "This is my daughter," she cried, "and I will not lose her." Regan's eyes locked onto Chris's. For a fleeting moment, the girl beneath the darkness shone through. "Mom," she whispered, voice cracking. "Help me." The voice of Legion screamed in rage. "Silence, you are mine." Regan convulsed violently, body twisting. Chris caught her, whispering words of comfort. Nolan and Vicenti intensified their prayers. The battle waged like a storm. The entity spoke through Regan, mocking the priests. "You are but children playing with fire. We are Legion, many, endless, infinite. You cannot break us." But with every word, Nolan and Vicenti responded with faith. Chris held Regan's hand tightly, focusing on the girl she knew was still there, fighting. Minutes passed like hours. Then, as the sun rose, a change came. The darkness in Regan's eyes receded. Her body relaxed. Her breath steadied. The chorus of voices faded into silence. Regan opened her eyes full, clear, bright, herself. Chris sobbed, holding her close. But the priests warned. "This is only a reprieve," Nolan said. "The Legion within is fractured, but not gone." Vicenti nodded. "It will try again. It will come back." Chris whispered, "We'll be ready." Outside, the morning light shone warmly. Inside, the battle between faith and darkness was far from over. The hollow beneath her bed, the sunlight filtering into Regan's room, did little to warm the atmosphere. Though her body was still, her eyes calm, something about this space felt wrong. Not just the lingering chill, or the faint scent of old smoke, but a sense of watching. Like the room itself was holding its breath. Chris McNeil didn't want to admit it, but she felt it to a low, almost inaudible hum beneath her feet. It was like the floorboards themselves vibrated with something unspoken. She tried to dismiss it as stress, exhaustion, paranoia, but deep down, she knew it wasn't in her head. She stood beside Regan's bed, adjusting the sheets gently around her daughter. Regan stirred slightly, but didn't open her eyes. Her voice, soft as a breeze, slipped from her lips. "Mom, there's something under my bed." Chris froze. She bent low and looked, heart hammering. "Nothing, just the usual shadows and dust." "Sweetheart, there's nothing there." Regan's hand gripped hers tightly. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not something, it's a door." That night, after Regan had fallen asleep, Chris couldn't stop thinking about her words. A door. In this room. She shook her head, but something compelled her to check again. Pulling a flashlight from the drawer, she got down on her knees and peered beneath the bed. And that's when she saw it. Not just floorboards, but a perfectly square outline in the wood. Subtle, but unmistakable. A thin seam framing what looked like a hatch. But this room was on the second floor. That made no sense. Her breath caught in her throat. She knocked on it. Hollow. Not the solid echo of floorboards, but the empty thud of space beneath. She backed away, legs trembling, and ran to find Father Nolan. Within minutes, both priests were in the room. Father Vicente examined the outline, while Nolan whispered protective prayers over Regan. "This wasn't here before," Chris insisted. "This wasn't part of the original construction." "I know this room." Vicente nodded. "Grim, I believe you." He pressed gently on the edge of the outline. It didn't budge. Then Regan sat up in bed, eyes wide open. "Don't open it." Her voice was her own, but filled with terror. "They're waiting." Vicente paused. "Who's waiting, Regan?" She turned slowly toward them. Her eyes shimmered in the candlelight. "The ones who call from underneath." Chris stepped closer. "What do they want?" Regan shook her head slowly. "They don't want. They just wait. They remember, and they whisper." Her hand reached toward the floor. "That's the hollow. They live in the hollow. They left the hatch untouched for 2 days." But things began to escalate. At night, Chris would hear tapping, 3 distinct knocks from beneath the bed. Then scratching. Regan would wake screaming, claiming hands reached through the cracks. Father Nolan tried sealing the hatch with salt and holy water. It smoked violently on contact. "The floor is reacting," he said. "This isn't just a physical space, it's spiritual." Vicente agreed. A breach, a portal, like a wound in the world. Chris could barely sleep. She sat by Regan every night, praying, watching, listening to the noises from below. On the 3rd night, everything changed. It was just past 3 a.m. Chris had dozed off beside the bed, her hand resting on Regan's arm. Then, suddenly, the bed jolted violently. Regan screamed. Chris sat up, heart racing. The bed shifted again, upward this time, as if something below it was trying to lift it. Vicente burst into the room with a flask of holy water and began chanting. The entire floor quivered, and then the hatch began to rise on its own. The wood split silently, revealing a black void beneath. Not stairs, not dirt, just darkness. Cold, pulsing, sentient. Regan screamed again. "He's here." Chris rushed to cover the hatch with her body, shielding Regan. But it wasn't wind or smoke or a figure that emerged. It was sound. 1,000 whispers all at once. Some in Latin, some in languages no one recognized, and one clear and terrible echoed out Regan's name. Regan. Just once. But it echoed through the room like thunder. Father Nolan grabbed the crucifix and stepped over the open hatch. "In the name of Christ, I seal this gate." The air crackled. Vicente sprinkled holy water, and the liquid turned to steam before it touched the void. Chris pulled Regan away from the hatch. The girl was sobbing, shaking uncontrollably. "I didn't open it," she cried. "I swear, I didn't call him again." Chris held her. "I believe you. I believe you." The hatch slammed shut with a force that knocked Vicente back. Silence returned, but it was not peaceful. The room felt violated, changed. The hatch remained visible, outlined clearly in blackened seams. They tried to cover it with furniture, rugs, seals. Nothing held. By morning, the furniture was moved aside by unseen hands. The seals burned to ash, and the hatch began to pulse. Like a heartbeat, Regan refused to sleep in the room again. She was moved temporarily to a small chamber near the chapel, where the priests could monitor her constantly. Still, she heard it. The voice, calling her. Not every night, but more often now. Sometimes it said her name. Sometimes it just whispered, soon. She stopped eating, stopped drawing. Her eyes, once so full of spark and fear, now just looked tired. I don't know how to keep it out, she whispered one evening. It's in the walls now. Vicente approached the hatch the next morning with a new idea. We seal it from below, he said. We go into the hollow. Chris and Nolan stared at him. You're serious? Nolan asked. I am. He held up an ancient relic, an iron medallion etched with a binding sigil. This was recovered from a monastery in southern Italy, said to have been used to close a portal during the Black Plague, when demons were blamed for the sickness. Chris felt her stomach turn. You're going down there? Vicente nodded. We don't have a choice. They waited until midnight. Nolan would stay with Regan and Chris in the chapel. Vicente and two trusted monks would descend. A rope was secured to his waist, candles and relics packed. The hatch opened at the stroke of 12. No wind, no sound, just stillness and blackness that swallowed light whole. Vicente looked once at Chris. If I don't come back, keep the girl safe. And then he disappeared beneath the floor. The rope went taut, then slack, then still. For minutes, nothing. Then a scream, distant, muffled, followed by dozens of voices rising in unison. We are the hollow, we remember. Chris collapsed to her knees. Regan whimpered from the next room. He shouldn't have gone alone. 32 minutes later, the rope pulled tight. Vicente emerged, covered in ash and frost. His eyes were wide with terror. He said nothing, just handed Nolan a stone tablet, cracked, heavy, ancient. On it, the same eye, the ring of flame, and beneath it, words in Latin. Do not speak his name, or he will wear yours. Back in Regan's room, the hatch was silent, dormant, but they knew it was not gone. It had merely been acknowledged. And what lives beneath knows patience. Regan looked up at Chris. Did he see it? Chris nodded slowly. He did. Regan whispered, then it knows he's coming. Chris asked, who? Regan's voice was steady now. The one behind the door. The final battle. The bells of the monastery rang at dawn. Not by human hands, but by something unseen. Something that seemed to tremble the very air. Regan McNeil had not spoken in 2 days. She sat curled in a chair in the chapel, staring at the crucifix above the altar. Her breathing was shallow, her presence ghostly. She looked neither fully awake nor fully asleep, trapped somewhere between, as though waiting for something inevitable to arrive. And that time had come. Father Nolan stepped into the room wearing full priestly vestments. A rosary hung from his belt. A leather-bound ritual book rested in his trembling hands. Behind him, Father Vicente stood in silence, bearing the ancient medallion retrieved from the hollow. His face was pale, but resolute. Chris stood beside Regan, her hand protectively resting on her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes were red from weeping, but her voice was steady. Is it time? Nolan gave a slow nod. Chris bent down to kiss Regan's forehead. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. No matter what happens, I'll be right here. The room prepared for the final exorcism was once the monastery's old refectory. High ceilings, stone walls, a single iron crucifix hung on the far end, nearly 2 meters tall. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting golden light that fought hard against the creeping shadows. In the center, a cot, draped in white cloth. Regan lay on it quietly, her wrists loosely bound not out of force, but precaution. She didn't protest, she didn't even blink. But as the priests took their positions on either side of her, her mouth curled into the faintest smile. Nolan opened the book of rites. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he began. Regan twitched. Vicente stepped forward, sprinkling holy water. The droplets hissed on contact with her skin. The smile vanished. Regan's eyes opened. Black, bottomless. "You came," she whispered, but it wasn't her voice. It was low, layered, impossibly deep. Nolan didn't answer. He continued the prayer. "God, protector of all who believe in you, bless this your servant, and send your holy angel from heaven." Regan laughed. "You think your angels can stand against me?" She convulsed suddenly, jerking against the cot. The ropes pulled tight. Vicente raised the medallion and began the Latin rites. "Exorcizo te, omnes spiritus immuned." The light in the room flickered. Wind whipped through the chamber, though all doors and windows were sealed. Regan thrashed, eyes rolling back. Her mouth opened witty and an inhuman scream filled the room. Chris clutched her rosary, kneeling in the corner. "Please," she whispered through her tears, "don't take her. Take me instead." Regan's head twisted toward her. "You would trade your soul so easily," the voice taunted. "Willingly," Chris cried. The entity paused. "You offer nothing I cannot take." And then it turned its rage toward the priests. The cot lifted inches off the ground. Objects hurled from the shelves. Candles snuffed out in rapid succession. But the priests held firm. "Through the blood of Christ, I command you of this child," Nolan shouted, raising the crucifix. "She is mine," the entity bellowed. Regan's skin began to blister, steam rising from her arms. She arched her back and screamed, but the scream fractured into a dozen voices echoing at once. Vicente advanced with the medallion, pressing it against Regan's chest. Smoke erupted from the contact point. Regan's voice split the air. "It burns." "Then leave her," Vicente roared. The room darkened again. Shadows crawled along the walls, reaching, slithering, and then the voice changed. It grew ancient, vast, and unmistakably powerful. "I was there when the first blood was spilled," it said. "I watched empires crumble. I whispered to kings, 'You do not command me.'" Nolan pressed forward. "We do not speak in our name, we speak in his." The crucifix glowed with an ethereal light. The shadows recoiled. Regan writhed violently. Black fluid seeped from the corners of her eyes and mouth. The cot shook. Then her voice changed to Gainsmiller, scared. "Mom, help me." Chris leapt to her feet, moving toward her daughter. But Nolan blocked her path. "Not yet," he warned. "It could be a trap." Chris hesitated. The voice cried again, "Mom." Tears streamed down her face. "She's still in there, I know she is." The priests pressed harder. Ex crucem dominifli, powers of darkness. Regan's body bent unnaturally, and with a sickening crack, her shoulders twisted out of joint. "You will break her before you break me," the entity hissed. Nolan's voice never faltered. "We cast you out, unclean spirit, satanic force, deceiver of mankind." The crucifix in his hand shook. A piercing wail erupted from Regan's body, so loud Chris clamped her hands over her ears. Suddenly, the cot crashed to the ground. Regan's eyes opened, wide, no longer black, but blood red. She gasped, and the voice that emerged was no longer mine, it was singular, deep, calm, final. "I am the one behind all others. I wear many names, but you may call me Despair." Chris felt her knees buckle. Nolan whispered, "He's revealing his true self." Vicente nodded. "We're close." Despair. The name echoed in the walls. The wind roared again. The flames from the candles flared. Chris heard voice not from Regan but from the air itself. Whispers of her worst fears. Memories of failure. Visions of Regan, lost and broken. She covered her ears. "No, no." Regan stared straight at her, lips moving without sound. Chris read the words. I'm still here." Nolan stepped forward, voice shaking but fierce. "Despair has no hold where love reigns." He dipped the crucifix in holy water and pressed it to Regan's forehead. "In the name of Christ, I bind you, I command you." The entity screamed, "I will not go." Regan thrashed violently. Then something changed. Her voice, Regan's own, rose through the screams. "I don't want you anymore. You need me," the demon howled. "No," Regan shouted, "you're nothing but lies." Chris dropped to her knees, joining the chant. Leave her now, leave my daughter." Vicente added his voice. The room seemed to quake. A light, soft and golden, began to shine behind the crucifix. Regan arched up once more. The voices wailed in agony. And then, silence. The body went still. The cot stopped shaking. The shadows vanished. Regan lay flat, eyes closed, chest rising and falling gently. The priests waited. Chris stepped forward, hand trembling. She reached down and touched her daughter's cheek. Warm, alive, human. "Regan," she whispered. The girl's eyes fluttered open, soft brown. Tears welled up. "Mom." Chris broke. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and sobbed uncontrollably. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're safe now." Father Nolan knelt beside the cot. He whispered the final line of the exorcism prayer. "Amen." Then he too wept, not out of fear but relief. Regan was back, and the demon was gone. They kept her under watch for 3 days. No more whispers, no more shadows, no more frost on the windows. She ate, she smiled, she drew pictures again of flowers and stars and her mother. The hollow beneath the bed remained sealed. No more pulses, no more sound. Father Vicente visited it once more and placed the relic over the seam. "I don't think it can open again," he said. "Not without another invitation." Chris nodded. "Then we never speak his name again." On the final night before they returned home, Regan asked Chris a question. "Will he ever come back?" Chris hesitated. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I know the Sayu are stronger now, and you're not alone." Regan nodded slowly. "Then I'm not afraid anymore." The sun rose over the monastery, casting warm golden rays across the floor where once shadows ruled. Regan stood at the gate with her mother and the priests. She looked back only once at the window of the room that had nearly consumed her. Then she turned away and walked forward, toward life, toward healing, toward peace. What was left behind? 6 months had passed. The leaves had changed. Snow had come and gone. Spring had arrived in Georgetown with its gentle winds and blooming cherry trees. But for the McNeil family, peace didn't return as easily as the seasons. Regan was home. Her room had been repainted. The crucifix above her bed remained, and Chris had added dream catchers, soft lights, and fresh plants, symbols of warmth, life, and safety. Regan's smile had come back, slowly, but her laughter was quieter now, cautious, as though it waited for the air to be truly safe before bursting free. No one spoke of what had happened at the monastery, not to outsiders, not even to each other, especially not about the final night. But something lingered, a sense, a knowing, because while Regan was free, something had stayed behind. Father Nolan had returned to his post in Rome. He wrote often, kind, gentle letters filled with prayers and encouragement. But his last letter ended on a strange note. "Tell her the door is sealed." But sealed doors sometimes remember who knocked. Father Vicente remained at the monastery, studying the ancient texts and tending to the chamber they'd sealed. He spent his nights in prayer, his days in silence. In one letter, he confessed, "There are still nights the wind carries voices, not screaming, not rage, just calling." Chris tried not to let these things in. She focused on Regan's recovery, school, sleep, friends, laughter, normal. But at night, sometimes, she'd stand outside her daughter's room and listen. just in case. One such night, Chris awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint, subtle, barely noticeable, like nails on wood. A whisper against her bedroom floor. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and waited. The sound stopped. She tiptoed to Regan's room. The girl was fast asleep, curled under a blanket, the gentle rise and fall of her breath soothing. Chris turned to Lev and paused. The dream catcher above the bed was spinning slowly. No windows were open, no draft, just slow, perfect rotation. She stared at it for a long moment, then backed out, closing the door without a sound. The next morning, Regan sat at the kitchen table, spooning cereal into her mouth absent-mindedly. Chris poured coffee, then asked casually, "Did you have any dreams last night?" Regan shrugged. "I think so. I don't remember." Pause. Then, softer, "There was something under my bed, maybe. But it wasn't scary." Chris's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Regan didn't look up. It just watched. It didn't move. Just watched. Chris forced a smile. Probably just left over from everything that happened. Regan stirred her cereal. Maybe. But Chris noticed that her daughter didn't eat another bite. That afternoon, Regan was in her room reading when a knock came from the closet. Not the door. Inside the closet. A soft, deliberate knock. 1, 2, 3. She stared at the door for a moment, then walked over, hand trembling slightly. She opened it. Nothing. Just clothes. Shoes. The usual. But the air inside was cold. Not freezing, but noticeably colder than the rest of the room. She shut the door quickly and returned to her bed, pulling the blanket around her. She didn't tell her mother. 2 weeks later, Chris found a drawing in the trash. It was one of Regan's sketches, something she hadn't done much since coming home. It showed a small wooden door beneath a bed, cracked open. From the crack emerged dozens of eyes, all open, all staring outward. In the corner, a figure sat cross-legged on the floor. It was Regan, smiling. Chris confronted her gently. "Sweetheart, what's this?" Regan looked confused. "I didn't draw that, but I found it in your trash. I haven't drawn anything in weeks." Chris felt a chill run up her spine. She didn't press further. That night, Regan had a dream. She stood at the edge of a staircase that spiraled down, carved into black stone. From below came soft chanting, familiar voices. They called her name, and not in anger, not in command, but in invitation. "Regan." She took one step down, then another. The air thickened. The voices grew louder, but instead of fear, she felt curiosity. She reached a stone door at the bottom. It opened by itself. Inside stood a figure, a shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, and it smiled. "I never left," it said gently. "You did." She screamed, and woke up gasping. Chris ran to her room. Regan was soaked in sweat, breathing rapidly. "It's okay," Chris said. "It was just a nightmare." But Regan didn't answer. She just stared at the wall. Chris turned to look. There, just above the baseboard, were 3 shallow scratches in the paint. Not there the day before. Not there during the repaint. Regan finally whispered, "I think he left something inside me." The doctors ran tests, psychological assessments. They found nothing. Regan was well, healthy, alert, rational. But Chris knew better. One evening, Regan stood by the window, staring at the sky. "Do you ever wonder where he went?" Chris stiffened. "Who?" Regan didn't answer. She just tapped the glass once, twice, 3 times, then turned and walked away. Father Vicenti's next letter arrived 2 days later. It read, "There was a noise beneath the chapel. We investigated the hollow. The relic was untouched, but the stone had cracked. Only one word was etched into the dust, soon." Chris didn't show Regan the letter, but that night, the power went out, only in Regan's room. The rest of the house was fine. In the days that followed, things escalated. Books falling without reason, drawings appearing in locked drawers, A shadow caught in the hallway mirror, just behind Rigangoni in a blink. Chris reached her breaking point when she found her daughter sleepwalking. She was standing in the center of her room, whispering something over and over again. When Chris got close, she heard it. "Let me back in, let me back in, let me back in." Chris shook her awake. Regan had no memory of it. They called Nolan. He flew in immediately, sat with Regan, prayed over her, talked gently. At first, everything seemed normal, but when he held out a crucifix, she laughed. Not Regan's laugh. A low, cold imitation. "Still trying your little tricks," the voice said. Nolan backed away. Regan blinked, then burst into tears. "I didn't say that," she cried. "I didn't." Chris held her tightly. Nolan looked pale. He knew. It had never truly left. That night, Chris made a choice. They couldn't wait for it to grow stronger. They had to contain it, bind it. They couldn't risk another possession. So, they returned on last to Meadow the monastery. The hollow was darker than before, the air heavier, the altar cracked, the seal broken. Vicente met them at the entrance, holding a new relic, a silver container with ancient markings. "A vessel," he said, "to draw what remains into it." Regan stood silently beside them. The wind stirred. A whisper in the dark. "Regan." She stepped forward. "I'm not yours anymore," she said firmly. No answer. The hollow waited. They descended together. Vicente placed the vessel in the center of the altar. Regan stood behind him. Chris held her hand. Nolan began the chant. Vicente joined. The air trembled. A voice screamed Edfant, then rising. The darkness surged from the corners, pulling toward the altar. The vessel shook. The screams intensified. Then, silence. The lid clicked shut. The vessel glowed once, then dimmed. Vicente placed it within a sealed tomb beneath the stone. "This time," he said, "we do not leave the door open." They sealed the hollow with concrete, sacred oil, and prayers spoken in 3 languages. Chris and Regan returned home. This time, the scratching did not return. The dream catcher stopped spinning. The shadows faded. Regan grew. She healed. But she never again slept with the light off. And she never walked barefoot in her room after dark. Chris kept the crucifix above the bed, just in case. Because sometimes, in the quiet hours, Regan would murmur in her sleep, words no one could understand. And once just Ansesh said a name, the one they were never supposed to speak. But Chris didn't ask her to repeat it. Some doors are better left unopened, even the ones beneath your bed.